This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy transition in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. It's impossible to talk about the clean energy transition and not bring up the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA was a watershed moment for climate legislation in the U.S., funneling $370 billion into clean energy technologies. The nonprofit organization Climate Power estimates that 100,000 jobs have already been created due to the legislation, and the bill is projected to cut U.S. emissions by 40% by 2040. But what is it? Aside from 264 pages of policy wonkiness, what does the IRA do and how does it actually support the energy transition? I'm not going to be able to cover everything in the IRA in an 8-minute podcast, but I will try to highlight some of the most important steps the bill took and try to make sense out of what the future may hold. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes for the sun's rays to hit Earth, or about how long I spent reading and rereading and rereading just the first 2 pages of the IRA. Enthralling stuff. Hey, I'll do the heavy lifting, you do the listening, let's get it on. The Inflation Reduction Act is a massive investment into climate technology and the clean energy transition. Sure, the IRA covers a whole bunch of other issues such as medical costs and, well, inflation. But the clean energy portion of the bill is the largest single federal piece of legislation towards climate to ever pass in the U.S. It's big, $370 billion big. And that's coming on the heels of the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. That legislation allocated billions towards reinforcing our transmission grid, building out carbon capture and hydrogen projects, and developing an EV charging network for the U.S. But whereas the IIJA was more grant-based, where dollars would be sent out directly to support specific projects, the IRA took a different approach. For the most part, the IRA is incentive-laden, built around tax breaks and discounts and less around grants or loans. Let's dive into a couple of the most consequential of those tax incentives, the clean energy tax credits and the clean vehicle credit. Renewable energy tax credits have been around for years. In a previous episode, I touched upon how the production tax credit, the PTC, and the investment tax credit, the ITC, has supported the build-out and development of the wind and solar markets here in the U.S. The IRA supercharges the tax incentives by enhancing and extending the ITC and PTC. For one thing, the IRA extends the current PTC and ITC through 2023 and 2024 before sunsetting those credits in favor of technology-neutral, emissions-based credit schemes. These clean electricity tax credits provide incentives to any facility producing clean energy. So in theory, nuclear or carbon capture facilities can now benefit from the new tax code. The IRA also extended the clean electricity credits for a full 10 years, doing away with the almost yearly struggle in DC to re-up the incentives. Anyone in the renewable energy industry will tell you about the challenges created by not having a clear line of sight into whether a tax credit was going to be around in a few years or not. And that lack of certainty has depressed the market until now. By giving a clear 10-year window to developers and banks, the IRA did away with one of the big obstacles facing clean energy development. And then, there are a couple of other things that the clean energy tax credits did that were kind of interesting. First, they changed the calculation a bit by putting more emphasis on projects that were built using prevailing wage standards or projects that were sourcing their materials from domestic content. You'll notice this as a theme, this Made in America incentive, and I'll return to it a little bit later. And the ITC and PTC created something called the direct pay option, which allows nonprofits and tribal communities and other tax-exempt organizations to get paid directly for the value of the credit. I mean, think about it. Tax-exempt organizations that don't pay taxes, they don't really need a tax credit. So the government finally made it easy and said, here's a check. Now, squished down in the IRA is also a PTC devoted to hydrogen, which is interesting. Hydrogen has great potential to replace natural gas as a clean-burning, zero-emissions fuel, but the infrastructure and production ability for hydrogen is really nascent. The bipartisan IIJA funnels at least $8 billion towards creating new hydrogen hubs and starting us down the pathway of scaling this infrastructure. But the IRA goes further by creating a production tax credit that allocates up to 60 cents per kilogram produced, depending upon the life cycle emissions of making that hydrogen in the first place. Life cycle emissions, what does that mean? Well, hydrogen that's created by splitting water molecules using electrolysis, that's powered by solar energy, for instance, is going to be viewed much more favorably than hydrogen electrolysis powered by coal power. Same hydrogen molecule at the end of the day, but how we got there is important. And that 60-cent incentive is just the beginning, as producers also have the ability to increase that up to 5 times through meeting prevailing wage requirements or, domestic content requirements. The Biden administration has set a target to reduce the cost of hydrogen by 80%, and the 1-2 punch of the IIJA and the IRA are big steps towards getting there. And then there's the clean vehicle credit, which the IRA creates in order to offer up to $7,500 to purchasers of EVs. Now, the federal government has always subsidized EV purchases, but previous versions of this credit were based on how many cars the manufacturer had sold. There was a cap, one that Tesla and others have already blown through. If you'd purchased a Tesla in early 2022, you weren't getting any EV rebate because the company had already exceeded their allotment. The new credit removes that cap in favor of some restrictions on the consumer side of the ledger. For instance, now there's an income-adjusted cap on the clean vehicle credit that kicks in for couples making more than $300K per year or individuals making more than $150K per year. And these credits only apply for cars that cost less than $55K or SUVs or trucks costing less than $80K. And you guessed it, the credit is reduced if the car isn't made in the US or uses domestic content in its manufacturing. These limitations on the credit have been pretty controversial, as unfortunately not a ton of EVs currently qualify for the full credit. But the IRA isn't just about climate and clean energy. The Biden administration structured this bill to advance their own ambitions around social and environmental justice, but also to help juice the domestic manufacturing industry. So much of our technology currently comes from overseas, and the federal government is obviously using the IRA both as a carrot to invest in clean renewable technologies, but also as an incentive to invest behind a U.S. supply chain. And it appears to be working. For instance, Ford recently announced a new mega battery plant to be built in Michigan. In fact, Forbes estimates that $28 billion in new manufacturing deals were announced in just the first few weeks after the signing of the IRA. So to wrap up, the IRA is an incentive-based piece of legislation aimed at galvanizing investment into clean electricity, hydrogen, clean vehicles, and into a domestic manufacturing supply chain. It could unlock hundreds of billions more in private capital as it has helped to de-risk so many of these markets. And it's legislated, which means it would be really difficult for future administrations to unwind, even if they wanted to. The IRA is a remarkable impetus for the energy transition. I'm Paul Schuster, and this has been your 8 Minutes.